Aaron, you remember my daughter, Lulu? Yeah, she's all grown up. But somewhere in our family albums, there is a photo of my daughter, age 4, with her preschool class, all dressed up to resemble pilgrims for Thanksgiving. In this picture, my daughter is scowling with pure resentment because she didn't like being dressed up for the entertainment of others. And she did not give a fig about pilgrims, Native Americans, or any of that old narrative. I treasure that photo because I also get a little snarly when people try and project their narratives onto me. You see, it's narrative that we are wrestling with when it comes to Thanksgiving. Because at this crucial point of examination, the critical examination of colonialism has interrupted that grade school story, and no amount of gravy will make genocide more palatable. But it's a powerful story, even though we know that it is woven out of myths and lies. So we need to go back and look at that old narrative and see how we might reweave it for our future. Remember the old story. The characters include the pilgrims who came to this land seeking religious freedom. We remember the kindness of the indigenous man Squanto. We remember the corn and the pumpkins. The grateful new settlers were welcomed into this new land by natives that they called Indians, who taught them how to plant corn and beans and squash. And then to celebrate the harvest of 1621, they had a big party that is now called the first Thanksgiving. They ate for 3 days and even played ball games. Pious people and noble savages alike, giving thanks for God's bounty. Version, right? But there are several versions of the story, and some of them are more true. Some of them are more bogus. You see, that year leading up to the first Thanksgiving was horrible. Of the original group died in the first year. Those who survived were eating venison and turkey with by graves. In more nuanced versions of the narrative, the native peoples are shown as having on the woefully underprepared invaders. But another fact to light, and that is that the native people themselves were still healing from the illnesses and death brought by explorers. The New England that the pilgrims settled upon included the graves of well over half of the earlier population. These deep losses on both sides were never quite reconciled in most versions of the story. And what was this day of Thanksgiving in 1621? Well, for the Puritan settlers, it wasn't. Yes, their religious leaders proclaimed such days from time to time, Thanksgiving, to acknowledge events like a really good rain or a harvest. But these days were actually spent at church, religious observation. It was not a feast day. Those 3 days of games and feasting with indigenous people was actually about sealing a political treaty, and it was not a day of time. As the Puritans became Congregationalists, and some of them even became Unitarian, local governments in the colonies adopted the habit of declaring a day of Thanksgiving in the fall to coincide with the harvest. But this was a day more than a holiday. And it was still up to each community, each state eventually, to decide if they wanted to participate. So the narrative about that 1621 event, the first Thanksgiving, was created, it was morphed by a Unitarian minister, Reverend Alexander Young. Reverend Young discovered a written account of the event and included it in a book that he published in 1881, we're talking over 200 years later. And in that book, he added a footnote identifying that the event, quote, was the first Thanksgiving, the harvest festival of New England, end quote. It wasn't. But he was familiar with Thanksgiving, and this looked like a Thanksgiving to him, so he decided it was. Meanwhile, one Sarah Josepha Hale, a widow, was supporting her family of 5 as the editor of women's magazines, and in 1846, as the country was being ripped apart by the issues that would lead to a civil war, proposed that the last Thursday in November, good day for a national Thanksgiving. To this end, she published editorials, and she wrote dozens of letters, and she sent reams of letters. And she even wrangled some of the transcendentalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Margaret, to write poems and stories to support the cause, and she spent years selling this idea. And in 1863, President Lincoln declared a day of Thanksgiving in hope of creating a national event that would help to unify a divided country. Notice that at this point, it is entirely a civic holiday with nostalgic religious roots. Needless to say, the Southern too. From that point on, politicians went and Reverend Young's Akins could participate in recreating this fictional history and heritage. Schools taught the myths so that waves of immigrant children could learn to identify with the Pilgrims. So that's some of the backstory on the Thanksgiving narrative. Now what? All right? Because here we are in a postmodern funk with the ability to see the exploitation and intolerance that shaped this history, this holiday, and how are we supposed to be happy celebrating what amounts to simply a bold-faced colonial land grab that resulted in the genocide of the native people? When we suppress any part of the truth, it has the tendency to rise up and haunt us, just as we're reaching for the stuffing. But what if we could reshape the narrative to be more inclusive and more intentional? What are the bits of that old narrative that are worth hanging on to? First, we have to acknowledge that Thanksgiving is a very blurry blending of civic holiday and with religious roots. It isn't Easter, and it's not the 4th of July. It's something in the middle, giving thanks for the generosity of the abundance and opportunity of this land, both the soil and its idealistic experiment. The civic core of that old story is all about becoming American, and we're also supposed to identify with the Pilgrims becoming American. But what if Thanksgiving became the holiday where people who are already Americans welcome the immigrants with a meal? What What if we were encouraged instead to identify with the Native Americans, not as cultural appropriation, but in recognition of their wisdom, their generosity, their reciprocity, and claims to this land? What if it was not just a gathering of family and friends, but it was an intentional gathering of settled people and newcomers? What if you measured your success by the number of immigrants that you welcomed to your table? And what if the meal was not just that fictional, traditional meal based upon New England ingredients like cranberries? We do not see cranberries here in Central Texas, right? What if we celebrated local ingredients like prickly pear and pecans? What if it was a meal that welcomed in the tamales and the ravioli and the samosas of the previous waves of immigrants? Wouldn't that be a meal worth celebrating? Wouldn't that give us all roles that we could live into more honestly? If we want to reclaim the religious core of that old story, we would give thanks for the harvest and for the discovery process that happens when we sit with people who are different from us and share a meal. What if Thanksgiving was to become the day that we look at our shared losses and blessings, and then look into the eyes of one another and be as generous as God in sharing? What if we could do that? What a country this would be. What a people we would be. What a feast that would be. May it be so someday for us all. Blessed be. Now, will you join with me in singing our